This is another speculation video, a case for Swedish designs, and their potential implementation in armored warfare. Once again, like with my video on French vehicles, I'd like to thank Alzak from the forum community, among others, for helping me with the research for this video. So, the Swedes. They may seem like a strange group to turn to in terms of armored vehicle development, but Sweden, for the entirety of the 20th century, really existed in a unique position. It was one of a few countries in Europe that was able to remain neutral during the course of the Second World War, and that helps you put some things into context about how they developed their war machines. They had an extensive tank force built during the Second World War just in case, and they also had an extensive fleet of vehicles over the course of the Cold War, just in case. Many of their machines during the Cold War were built primarily with defensive combat in mind, and they were built for this task in some very interesting ways. I think many of the machines I'll cover would, at the very least, serve as very unique and interesting designs to work with. The first and most notable design from Sweden would definitely be the Stridsvagn 103, commonly called the S-Tank. And I'll refer to it as the S-Tank for the remainder of this video so that I don't butcher the pronunciation of it for all of the Swedish viewers watching this. This vehicle has a reputation that precedes it among tank historians. Obviously, upon initial glance, this machine certainly doesn't look like a tank. It looks a lot more like an older design, like an assault gun or a tank destroyer with its gun mounted in a casement instead of a turret. When you dig a little deeper, it gets even stranger since the gun is actually fixed. The manner in which the gun is aimed is very unique then. It's aimed left and right by turning the hull, but it's aimed up and down by adjusting the tank's suspension to various degrees. The rear is raised to point the gun down, and the front is raised to point the gun up. The Swedes considered this thing a main battle tank because, to them anyway, it fulfilled the role. To many, this would seem like a bizarre design choice and more of an example of over-engineering than practicality, but in theory, I think this design makes sense. The S-Tank wasn't meant to function like other main battle tanks. It was meant to function exclusively in a defensive posture. During the Cold War, a great fear to many was the effect of a Soviet invasion. You might have noticed this machine's highly sloped armor. That's not a coincidence. The S-Tank was made to take advantage of Sweden's hilly and forested terrain and fire at enemies from a stationary position. But there's more to the S-Tank than its strange mean of aiming the gun. The gun in question was a 105mm Bofors that could fire the same ammunition as the British Royal Ordnance L7. Rather interestingly, though, the gun was hooked up to an auto-loading system located in the vehicle's rear that allowed it to fire a round every 4 seconds. The autoloader also meant the machine didn't need a dedicated loader, and the smaller cruise size allowed the size and profile of the machine to be further lowered. If that wasn't weird enough, the tank's third crew member was actually a guy who had the cruel misfortune of sitting in the tank backwards. The tank's rearward driving capabilities were the same as its forward driving capabilities, so in the event that the tank needed to book it, this crew member could operate the tank and drive it backwards while keeping the gun and armor faced forwards towards the enemy. The tank was also fitted, and yes, I'm still going, with 2 engines. One was a diesel piston engine used for cruising and aiming the gun. The other was a gas turbine that could be engaged when the tank needed to move at combat speeds or whenever it encountered severe terrain. It was also amphibious. Okay, I think that's everything. Now, I would hate to be the mechanic working on this thing, but there's no denying that it was certainly a gutsy design, and I think it's worth applauding the Swedish engineers that put this thing together. Fortunately, the S-Tank never had a trial by combat in the fires of a Soviet onslaught, but the rationale behind its design seems like it was sound. The S-Tank was made in 4 progressively upgraded variants. I can see these things functioning as a side branch of main battle tanks. Obviously, the fixed gun would be an interesting concept to work with, and I'd be curious to see how Obsidian would tackle such a thing if they decided to implement it. I think you can make the autoloader work. Some would say that rate of fire is OP, but this tank has its disadvantages in the fact that it doesn't have a turret and would absolutely have to function defensively for it to be used properly. The rearward driving capability would be interesting to see too, though I don't know if they'd go through with that for balance considerations. They'd probably fit from tiers 3 to 5 or 4 to 6, give or take. Anyway, that's enough about the S-Tank. Meet the IKV 91. I'd say the full designation, but I don't know Swedish, and that's a lot of syllables. This thing was a highly mobile light tank weighing only about 16 tons. It was fitted with a set of sophisticated sighting systems to make it usable as a tank destroyer. A main battle tank with a fixed gun, and a turreted tank destroyer. Needless to say, a little bit different. The IKV was also mounted with a Bofors, a 90mm, but there's not really a whole lot more to say about it other than that it existed in two versions, the base model and an upgun version with a 105mm. I'm assuming the same Bofors that the S-tank used, but don't quote me on that. Obviously, some turreted tank destroyers with treads would be interesting. We already have one in the form of a premium vehicle, the AMX-10, with the ERC's turret mounted on top, so I don't think it's totally out of the realm of possibility. Or maybe they'd give the vehicle a light tank designation anyway for other reasons. Still, I think the machine was meant to function as a sniper in stationary positions, and naturally, I think if you're going to implement it in-game, it ought to take advantage of the tank destroyer class ability, but that's just me. Not much more to say about the IKV, but there are others, even self-propelled guns. There's the matter of a modern artillery system mounted on wheels. It's called the Archer. Wheeled artillery isn't a particularly strange concept, and I suppose I could do some videos on the topic at a later time, but this thing seems neat. Perhaps our first tier 9 or even tier 10 artillery piece. It mounts a 155mm howitzer on the 6x6 chassis of a Volvo truck. It carries up to 21 rounds, and it can move in a wide range of terrain up to 70 kilometers per hour. I don't think the Volvo 200,000 mile club will come to Armored Warfare anytime soon, but I like the idea of having a shoot and scoot artillery piece like this. Some might say that mobility could be overpowered, but I'm not a game mechanics expert. I'm just pointing out things I find interesting. A treatise on wheeled SPGs does sound intriguing, though. Moving on from that, there is another vehicle worth mentioning, a modern IFV called the Combat Vehicle 90. It's a contemporary to other IFVs currently in service, like the Bradley or the Warrior, but just take a whiff at that big ol' 40mm Bofors autocannon. It's reasonably quick and built to navigate the rough and snowy terrain of the Swedish hills. So far, it's been received well by the nations that field it. The chassis is used to develop a number of different vehicles, like mortar carriers, anti-aircraft guns, and this thing. Yeah. The PL-01, that weird-looking light tank you can look at in the previews section. It shares the same hull. My knowledge of the PL-01 is a bit limited though, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. Unlike most of the vehicles I mentioned in this video, the Combat Vehicle 90 has been battle-tested in the fires of the Middle East among other Scandinavian militaries. I don't think adding it to the game as a potential Tier 9 vehicle for Shishkin's AFV line we have right now would be too far of a stretch. Again, just a guess. You guys could dig up more details on the placement of such a vehicle in terms of tiering on this stuff better than I could, but that's a general idea of Swedish armored fighting vehicles throughout the course of the 20th century. Obviously, I can't do all of them justice in a short amount of time, but these are the ones that I found particularly interesting. Like I said, perhaps not enough to make any lines of tech from Tier 1 to Tier 10, but certainly unique enough to warrant addition to the game. Do you have any other ideas? Let me know in the comments. As always, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe for more content like this, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching.